Lucas tightened the straps of his delivery bag, feeling the cold night air bite at the exposed skin of his hands. The city stretched around him like a half-forgotten dream. Streets empty except for the occasional flicker of neon signs reflecting in puddles left by the afternoon rain. Street lights flickered lazily, casting long, thin shadows that seemed to stretch toward him as if reaching for his ankles. Each step he took echoed faintly against the cracked pavement, the sound amplified by the silence that weighed heavier than any crowd. He had taken the night shift for a reason. Rent was due, bills stacked like leaning towers in his small apartment, and daytime work hadn't yielded much. The promise of fast money, late hours, and anonymity had felt almost freeing. Yet now, as he wheeled his bike through the dark streets, a shiver ran down his spine, not entirely from the chill. The first few deliveries were ordinary enough. Warm pizza boxes, plastic bags of greasy takeout, the dull beep of his phone marking each successful drop-off. The residents were brief, almost robotic, barely looking at him as they snatched their orders. Lucas noted the monotony, the repetitiveness, yet found a strange comfort in it. Night shifted something inside him, made the world feel sharper, edges more defined. But then came the unusual order. The app pinged with a location that didn't quite fit, an address in a district he had never delivered to, streets crumbling into weeds, and derelict cars parked like forgotten toys. The house itself stood at the end of a narrow lane, 2 stories of peeling paint and boarded windows. Something in the stillness of the place made Lucas hesitate, a whisper in the back of his mind warning him to turn back. He dismissed it. Orders didn't wait. Bills didn't wait. As he approached the house, the wind seemed to gather, hissing past the corners of the broken shutters. The air was colder here, unnaturally so, carrying the sharp tang of damp wood and rusted metal. Lucas dropped the food on the cracked porch, hearing the soft thud echo against the hollow interior. No one answered. No light flickered from within. Just shadows, stretching, twisting in shapes his mind almost recognized. Almost. He waited a beat, half expecting a door to swing open or a figure to appear. Nothing. The silence was complete, oppressive, thick enough to taste. And then, as he turned to leave, he swore he saw a shape in the top window. Just a flicker of movement, a shadow leaning forward, observing. He blinked, and it was gone. Only the empty, silent house remained. Lucas pedaled back toward the streetlights, heart hammering, trying to shake the sense of being watched. His hands trembled, not from cold, but from adrenaline. The city around him felt different somehow. Edges too sharp, shadows too deep. He shook his head. Just a trick of the light, he muttered to himself. And yet, even as he thought it, the memory of that fleeting shadow burned in his mind. Something was waiting in the night, and he had just entered its streets. By the time he returned to the center of the city, the neon glow and occasional hum of passing cars had restored a semblance of normalcy. Yet a seed of unease had planted itself deep in Lucas's chest. Night was no longer just a shift in the day. It had become a corridor into something unfamiliar, something watching, patient, and hungry. And the first order of the night had been just the beginning. The next night, Lucas pedaled through the same streets, though they no longer felt the same. Shadows clung more insistently to the corners of buildings. The wind whispered through alleys like a voice he almost recognized, but never fully heard. Every sound, the hum of a distant transformer, the scrape of a loose metal sign swinging, felt amplified, intrusive. He told himself it was just nerves, first-night jitters. But the tension had a sticky weight that refused to lift. The first few deliveries were routine, yet even routine had changed. Faces of the residents seemed slightly altered, eyes flicking toward him for a moment too long before returning to their phones, to their rooms, to their monotony. The streets seemed emptier, as if the city itself had exhaled and withdrawn from him. And then came the second strange order. Another abandoned house, not far from the first. Lucas hesitated at the corner. The house was a squat 2-story brick building, its windows shattered or darkened with grime. The yard was overgrown with weeds that scraped at his tires. He could feel the air thicken as he approached, a subtle vibration under his feet, almost like the building itself was alive. He dropped the bag on the warped porch and waited, listening. Silence. Then, just for a moment, a flicker of movement in the attic window. A shadow, slanted, leaning forward. He blinked. Nothing. His chest tightened. Something about these houses felt purposeful, as if they weren't abandoned at all. He shook his head, tried to focus on the next order, and pedaled onward. But the city now seemed to fold in on itself. Streets he thought he knew twisted unexpectedly. Neon signs flickered into shapes that made him stumble, turning familiar streets into corridors of unease. By the third delivery, the unease had become a constant hum in his mind. He noticed subtle things. Streetlights that should have been overhead seemed to flicker behind him. Shadows that should have been static seemed to inch closer, just at the edge of his vision. A cat darted from the darkness, but when he looked again, it had vanished entirely. The fourth delivery was the most unsettling yet. The address led him into a narrow alleyway he didn't recognize. Rusted dumpsters lined the walls, and the only sound was his own breathing and the soft squeak of his bike tires. At the end of the alley was a townhouse, its door slightly ajar. The smell of mold and decay wafted out, sharp and acrid. Lucas's hand shook as he set the bag down. A whisper, or was it a laugh, seemed to echo from inside. He spun around. Empty alley. He tried to convince himself he imagined it. The nights were long. The mind played tricks. Fatigue weighed on him. Still, an instinct he could not ignore told him to look closer. Slowly, he stepped forward, peering into the darkness of the open doorway. The interior was a void of black shapes. Furniture, walls, stairs. He couldn't tell. And then he saw it. A figure in the corner, unmoving, tall, thin, watching. Lucas froze. He wanted to call out, to move, but fear held him like chains. The figure remained still. Slowly, it tilted its head, as if acknowledging him. The moment stretched. Lucas's pulse raced, his breathing shallow, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and something else. Something metallic. Then, just as suddenly, the figure was gone. Only the darkness remained, silent and patient. He pedaled away, faster than he had ever pedaled before. Even as the city lights returned, illuminating familiar streets, the sense of being followed did not fade. Every alley he passed, every shadow along the pavement, seemed alive. It wasn't until he reached the neon glow of the downtown district that he finally slowed, hands trembling, trying to calm the pounding in his chest. That night, Lucas lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Every creak of his apartment, every rustle of wind against the window, sounded amplified. He realized he couldn't shake the feeling that the city, or something in it, had noticed him. That the abandoned houses were no longer merely places to deliver food. They were observatories, traps, portals for something patient, something waiting. Sleep came eventually, but uneasy, punctuated by flashes of the shadows, of eyes in windows, of movement in places that should have been still. He knew one thing. Tomorrow night, he would ride again. And tomorrow night, whatever it was, would be waiting. The nights were blending together now, each one bleeding into the next like ink spreading across wet paper. Lucas pedaled through streets that had begun to feel like a labyrinth, familiar, yet subtly wrong. Neon signs flickered into shapes that weren't there before. Storefronts he remembered as closed now seemed to breathe. Windows dark but reflective, as though the city itself was watching him. The strange orders were becoming more frequent, each one from a building that should have been empty. The pattern was unmistakable now. Abandoned houses, narrow alleyways, crumbling townhouses. Each delivery left him with the same lingering chill. A sense that he was not merely delivering food, but participating in some unseen ritual. On one night, he arrived at a delivery only to find the door slightly open, the smell of damp wood and rust hitting him before he even stepped inside. A shadow shifted at the edge of his vision, and when he turned, there was nothing. He moved cautiously through the foyer, the floorboards groaning under his weight. Every room was a tableau of decay. Furniture overturned, wallpaper peeling, dust motes dancing in shafts of pale moonlight. And yet, in each room, he could sense eyes on him. Lucas began to notice patterns that made no sense. Houses that he had never delivered to seemed to repeat. Layouts eerily familiar, as if he had been inside them before. He would glance at the address on his phone and realize he had delivered here the night before. Or thought he had. Streets twisted and looped unexpectedly. Alleys he had memorized now ended in walls or open fields. The city was becoming unrecognizable, a shifting maze designed to trap him. On a particularly cold night, he found himself at a narrow alleyway he didn't recognize. The air was thick, almost viscous, carrying the scent of rot and something acrid, metallic. At the end of the alley stood a townhouse, its windows darkened with grime. He approached cautiously, placing the delivery bag on the warped wooden porch. And then he saw it. A shadow, slouched in the corner of the top floor window, watching him. The figure was human-shaped, unnaturally thin, with elongated limbs that bent at odd angles. It didn't move at first, simply observing. Lucas felt a chill that reached his bones, a primal fear that whispered he should flee immediately. But curiosity rooted him in place. The shadow tilted its head slightly, acknowledging him, before vanishing entirely. The city no longer felt like a collection of streets and buildings. It was a living organism, its shadows stretching and twisting, guiding him toward unknown destinations. Each delivery became a test, a series of trials he did not understand. At times, he swore the streets themselves were moving under his wheels, bending and folding around him. Neon signs morphed into shapes resembling eyes, reflecting his own wide, fearful gaze back at him. Sleep had become a fleeting luxury. Each morning, Lucas woke with his body tense, muscles stiff, heart racing as if he had been running all night. He began keeping a notebook, recording addresses, times, and oddities he observed. Patterns emerged. The abandoned houses were clustered in the same district, but streets between them seemed to rearrange themselves at night. Even when he returned to familiar areas, the city seemed to have shifted subtly, making him doubt his memory. One night, he arrived at a delivery to a house he recognized immediately. The first strange house from his very first shift. He froze. Nothing in the world looked right. The yard was overgrown, but the weeds seemed to writhe slightly in the pale moonlight. The house itself appeared taller, more oppressive. He stepped onto the porch, and the air shifted, thickening around him. The door creaked open slowly, as though inviting him inside. Inside, the house was a twisted echo of memory. Rooms he remembered were slightly altered, walls slanted unnaturally, furniture elongated, shadows pooling in corners where they shouldn't exist. A whisper, low and unintelligible, brushed against his ear. He turned, but the rooms were empty. And then he saw them. Faces in the wallpaper, distorted, screaming silently, eyes following his every movement. The sensation of being watched became unbearable, a weight pressing against his chest. Lucas stumbled back, almost dropping the delivery. His hands were shaking, knees weak. He realized with a sickening clarity that this was no ordinary city, no ordinary night shift. Something had taken notice of him. Something patient. Something that had been waiting for him to arrive. He could feel it observing, anticipating his movements, testing his reactions. Panic rose in his chest, but he forced himself to continue. Every step, every delivery, every pedal stroke was a gamble. The city had become a maze of observation, its streets and buildings extensions of a consciousness that was both malignant and meticulous. Shadows moved with intent. Doors opened and closed on their own, and whispers followed him wherever he went. By the end of the shift, Lucas was exhausted in a way he had never experienced. His body ached, his mind was fraying, and yet he could not stop. The orders kept coming, each one more disturbing than the last. Each one reinforced the unshakable truth. He was no longer merely a courier. He had become a part of the city's nocturnal rhythm, a player in a game whose rules he did not understand. And whatever waited in the shadows, it was learning, adapting, growing bolder with each passing night. Lucas pedaled home under a sky dark and heavy with clouds. The streets, once familiar, were now alien. Every corner, every shadow, every flicker of light seemed imbued with intent. He knew one thing for certain. The city had claimed him. And tomorrow night, he would ride again. Lucas had learned to move through the city at night, like a ghost. Each alley, each abandoned house, each flicker of neon light had become a marker in a map that only he could read. And yet, nothing had prepared him for this night. The order appeared on his phone with an urgency that made the vibrations feel like warnings. The address, unfamiliar, yet eerily similar to every abandoned house he had visited, was at the edge of the district he had begun to dread. He pedaled faster than usual, heart hammering, breath misting in the cold night air. Shadows seemed to stretch toward him as he approached, thickening and darkening, pressing against the edges of his vision. A low hum vibrated through the pavement, subtle at first, then swelling to a resonance that seemed to match the beat of his heart. Lucas tried to shake it off, telling himself it was fear, exhaustion, imagination. But the city itself seemed to pulse with awareness. The house was colossal compared to the others. Its facade was rotted, windows gaping, doors cracked. But its presence was magnetic, drawing him forward. The air around it was heavier, carrying the scent of mold, damp earth, and something metallic, sharp and bitter. He left the bike on the curb, delivery bag in hand, and stepped onto the porch. The floorboards groaned beneath him, each creak sounding like a scream in the stillness. Inside, the house was a labyrinth of darkness. Stairs led to rooms that seemed impossibly high, corridors twisted back on themselves, and shadows pooled in corners, thick as ink. The faint flicker of moonlight through shattered windows revealed shapes that shouldn't exist. Walls that bent, furniture stretched into grotesque proportions, portraits on the walls with faces that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. And then he saw it. At the end of the hall, a figure stood, thin and elongated, a silhouette that seemed too tall for human anatomy. Its head tilted unnaturally, as if inspecting him. Shadows coiled around it, like tendrils of darkness, writhing and twitching with life. Lucas felt the air tighten around his lungs. The instinct to flee was immediate, but curiosity and something darker kept him rooted. The figure moved, not walking, but gliding, a motion that warped the shadows around it. Lucas's chest ached with panic, his mind screaming to run, but his body felt paralyzed, heavy. He could hear whispers now, low, unintelligible, echoing from walls, floors, and ceilings. They weren't words. They were feelings. Hunger, patience, malice. He tried to drop the delivery bag and step back, but it was as if the house itself resisted. Doors slammed shut behind him, corridors elongated. The shadows thickened, wrapping around him like coils. The figure reached toward him, its hands impossibly long, fingers bending in unnatural angles. He expected pain, but instead, he felt observation. The kind of scrutiny that burrows into the mind, making every thought a confession. Images flashed in his mind, houses, streets, previous deliveries, faces of strangers blurred into shapes he couldn't distinguish. The figure's presence merged with the house, the shadows, the air. Lucas realized the horrifying truth. He had not been delivering food. He had been delivering himself. Each order, each address, each night had been preparation, a gradual tightening of the snare. Panic finally broke through. He ran. Hallways stretched endlessly, doors opened to nowhere, staircases twisted impossibly. Yet the figure followed, gliding silently, always just out of reach, always observing, always knowing. Shadows lunged, brushing against him, whispering, writhing, testing his fear. He burst into what appeared to be a large central room, moonlight spilling through broken windows. The figure was there, stationary, yet every shadow in the room seemed to converge on it. Lucas's knees buckled, adrenaline and terror merging into a wave that left him trembling. He knew he had no escape. The house, the figure, the night. It had all been designed for this moment. And then, a door slammed open behind him. He froze. Movement, a fleeting chance. Lucas sprinted toward it, shadows lashing out, fingers brushing, scraping. His mind screamed as the figure reached with impossibly long arms, fingertips grazing his shoulder. Pain didn't follow, but the sensation was profound, intimate, as though the figure had read his thoughts, his fears, his very essence. Lucas stumbled into the night. The city outside was unchanged, yet changed. Streets stretched differently, alleys bent, familiar buildings warped. The figure didn't follow, or perhaps it did, unseen, embedded in shadows, waiting. He knew one truth. The night had claimed him as surely as the house had. And yet, he was alive. Barely. Breath ragged, hands shaking, Lucas pedaled through the distorted streets, each turn, each shadow, each sound a reminder that nothing would ever be the same. The city watched, patient and silent, and he knew, with a sinking dread, that the game was far from over. Lucas returned to his apartment, or at least he thought it was his apartment. The streets were familiar, but subtly wrong. Streetlights flickered in patterns he didn't recognize, casting shadows that stretched unnaturally across the pavement. Doors to buildings he knew well opened into rooms that should not exist. A park he passed every day had turned into a dense, dark grove, with trees that whispered as he pedaled past. The city itself seemed to pulse with awareness. Each corner, each shadow attuned to his fear. He tried to rest that day, but sleep eluded him. Every creak of his apartment, every passing car, every murmur of wind against the window seemed magnified. A constant reminder that he was still being watched. His mind, already frayed from nights of deliveries and encounters with the shadows, began to slip. Faces from the houses appeared in his dreams, twisted and silent, reaching out, asking questions he did not understand. The orders didn't stop. As if sensing his hesitation, the app continued to ping with new addresses. He opened it and froze. Addresses of houses he had never seen before, yet each one carried the same aura. Abandoned, decrepit, patient. Even the familiar ones were distorted, their outlines flickering and shifting as he scrolled through. The pattern was clear. He wasn't being given a job. He was being guided, led deeper into something he didn't yet comprehend. That night, Lucas pedaled into the streets, his heart heavy. Each building, each alley, seemed alive, bending and reshaping around him. He glimpsed shadows moving on their own accord, corners of buildings warping to form shapes that felt like faces. A chill ran down his spine as he realized that even the sky looked different, heavier, darker, oppressive, as if the clouds themselves had weight and intent. He reached an alley he vaguely remembered, one he had delivered to multiple times. The familiar townhouse at the end had changed. Windows appeared higher, walls stretched unnaturally, and a low hum emanated from within. He approached cautiously, the delivery bag feeling heavier than usual, almost like a burden beyond food. Shadows coiled at the edges of his vision, teasing and luring him forward. Inside, the house had shifted even further. Hallways twisted at impossible angles, stairs led to dead ends, doors opened into rooms that seemed suspended in time. The whispers were louder now, taunting, probing, filling the space with a sensation that Lucas could not shake. He was being tested, measured, evaluated. Every step he took felt preordained, as though the building knew where he would move before he moved. He tried to find a window, a door, any exit, but the house resisted. Shadows lunged, brushing his arms, crawling across the floor, sticking to him like cold, wet cloth. His pulse raced. He realized he had become part of the city, part of the labyrinth, part of the pattern he had failed to understand. Each delivery, each shift, had been a preparation, and now he was caught. Exhausted, terrified, Lucas stumbled into a central room, a place that seemed familiar, yet alien. Moonlight spilled through broken windows, illuminating shapes that were at once furniture and something else entirely. Faces appeared in the warped walls, screaming silently, their eyes following him. The figure, the elongated, thin shadow, stood there, waiting. And Lucas finally understood. It had been here the entire time, in the corners of his vision, in the folds of the city, observing, patient. He wanted to flee, but the house resisted. Doors slammed shut, hallways twisted, corridors stretched infinitely. Shadows coiled around him, whispers rising to a crescendo that rattled his mind. He fell to his knees, shaking, gasping for air, the oppressive weight of the city pressing down on him. He realized that nothing in this night would ever be normal again. The streets, the alleys, the buildings, they had claimed him. And whatever he had glimpsed in the shadows, was no longer waiting for him. It was part of him now. Lucas emerged from the house hours later, or maybe it was minutes. Time felt meaningless. The streets were empty, yet filled with eyes he could not see. The familiar city had dissolved into something alien. Even as he pedaled toward the apartment he once called home, he knew it was gone. The city had changed, and he had changed with it. The app pinged again. A new delivery, a new address. Lucas's hands shook as he stared at the screen. He wanted to scream, to throw the phone, to ride away as fast as he could. But he couldn't. The orders were not optional. They were inevitable. He swallowed hard, feeling the heavy weight of the delivery bag on his shoulder. The shadows seemed to lean closer, whispering, twisting the city around him. The night was no longer simply a shift. It was a ritual. And he was the reluctant participant, trapped in a cycle he could not escape. Lucas pedaled through the empty streets, his body numb from exhaustion, his mind frayed by nights of impossible deliveries. The city stretched before him, familiar yet distorted, as though it had been rewritten while he slept. Street lights flickered in erratic rhythms. Shadows pooled and stretched in ways that made the world feel alive. Waiting, aware. He stopped at the corner of an alley and looked at the app. The latest delivery flashed on the screen. He froze. The address was the very same one. The first house he had ever delivered to. The one that had set this entire nightmare in motion. A chill ran down his spine. Time had no meaning here. Nights had no sequence. He was trapped in a cycle he could not escape. The city itself seemed to hum around him. Buildings leaned toward the street as if curious, windows reflecting shapes that weren't there. The wind whispered through the cracks in the walls, carrying the faint echoes of his own footsteps. Whispers of voices he had heard long ago in abandoned houses. His hands shook as he gripped the handlebars. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to pedal in any direction, to leave this city behind forever. But there was nowhere to go. Lucas approached the house. Its facade looked the same, yet different. The peeling paint and boarded windows seemed more oppressive, more alive. Shadows pooled under the eaves, stretching toward him like fingers. He left the bike on the curb and stepped onto the porch, heart hammering, breath catching in his throat. The door creaked open, slow, deliberate, as if expecting him. Inside, the house was unchanged and yet transformed. Rooms he remembered were warped, hallways twisted in impossible angles, shadows pooled in corners, thick and sentient. Faces appeared in the wallpaper, distorted, screaming silently, eyes following him. And there it was. The figure, thin and elongated, gliding silently across the room. Its presence filled the space, pressing into his mind, reading him, weighing him, testing him. Lucas realized the terrible truth. He was no longer merely a courier. He had become part of the city's rhythm, part of its night. The deliveries had been a preparation, a tether that bound him to the streets, to the shadows, to the figure that watched in patience and silence. Every order, every turn, every shadow had led him here. He was trapped in a loop, a cycle that would repeat endlessly, night after night. He wanted to flee, to break free, but the house resisted. Doors slammed shut, staircases twisted impossibly, corridors stretched into infinity. Shadows lunged at him, brushing his skin, whispering, testing his fear. His legs moved of their own accord, carrying him through familiar yet alien rooms, each step reinforcing the trap that he had failed to escape. And then the app vibrated. A new order. Another address. Lucas's heart sank. He lifted his eyes from the floor and read the screen. It was the first house again. The cycle was unbroken. The city had claimed him. The shadows had claimed him. The figure had claimed him. And the night continued. Patient, unyielding, eternal. Lucas sank to the floor, trembling. He tried to scream, but no sound emerged. He looked around at the warped walls, the shifting shadows, the figure that glided silently in the corner of his vision. It waited, watching, patient. And he understood, with a crushing clarity, that there was no escape. The city, the night, the shadows, they were infinite. And he would peddle these streets forever, a courier in a labyrinth that had no end. He closed his eyes for a moment, only to open them and find the city unchanged. The streetlights flickering, the shadows writhing, and the app pinging once more. Another delivery, another cycle. And in that moment, Lucas realized that fear had become his constant companion, and the night had become his only home. The streets whispered his name, the shadows leaned closer, and he pedaled forward, trapped in a loop he could never break, forever chasing orders that would never end.